Return with me to Colossians chapter 3 this morning. And we move now into a new pericope, starting in verse 18 of that chapter and making our way through the end of it and even into the first verse of the next. We are in the midst of a set of concluding imperatives that Paul gives to the church he's writing to, the church at Colossae. He's writing some bolstering commands that guide the believer in how to actually live out this righteous, justified standing before God. What true sanctification looks like. This is how it comes out in the life of the believer. Not the false pieties of those who had come to Colossae with all of their moralistic tendencies, their pieties, their outward show, as we see in chapter 2. But the true piety of living in holiness as a function of being transformed into glory. In other words, this is what it means for Paul to say in chapter 2, verse 6, walk in Him. This is what it means to walk in Him. What it means to truly live for Christ. Now, what we saw in verses 5 to 11 of this chapter was the first of these bolstering commands, which is to put off the old self, put off the old nature, put off all that old stuff that was a part of us and characterized us before the Spirit had His way with us. Sexual impurity, anger, obscene talk, wrath, etc. Recognizing what the reprobate man is and saying, I'm not going to live like that anymore. That's in the past. So put off the old self, Paul says. Then we saw in verses 12 to 17, which you remember we spent 6 whole weeks on because it's a lot of stuff to go through. Paul said, put on the new nature. Put off what is old, put on what is new. Here's the new nature. Put on compassionate hearts. Put on humility. Put on patience. Put on forgiveness. Cover it over with love. Undergird it with peace. And wrap the whole thing in a sense of gratitude, as though everything is gratitude for the work of Christ. So Paul gives us first, put off the old, now, or what we saw next was put on the new, and now he's going to give what I call some closing imperatives. So he's going to complete this process. So it's almost as though he starts with walk in Christ, put off the old, put on the new. Now let me give you some overarching examples and principles to apply to that. And then I'll finish it up with some final words, some final exhortations. So 3:18 to 4:1 is Paul's specific applications of what we just talked about in putting on the new self. What does it look like to have a compassionate heart? What does it look like to be loving and patient and kind and at peace and all these kinds of things? What does this new nature look like in practice? In other words, if you're looking for application, this is it. This is Paul saying, let me tell you how you ought to do this. Let me show you some specific things. Now, Paul is going to use here some examples from the household. He's going to go to the household. He's going to go to the various roles that are contained within the household. And he's going to do so, in my opinion, I think the reason he does is because virtually everyone would be covered in these examples. Virtually everyone would be covered. Okay, maybe there's a single man or a single woman out there that wouldn't really apply, but it does in the grander scheme of things. So Paul is going to use the household, which everybody would be familiar with, as his examples because he figures I'll touch the most that way. And he's going to talk about 6 specific roles in the household. Wives and husbands, children and fathers, servants and masters. And he's going to do so in 3 distinct pairs: spouses, parents, laborers. Do you see the pattern? So it starts with 6 different individuals in 6 different roles and then combined into individual pairs. And each time that he brings the pairs, he brings the submissive one first. Wives before husbands, children before fathers, servants before masters. So he brings it in that particular order. And you will notice also that each role that he mentions is delivered as a simple two-sided pair. Wives, be submissive to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. You see that pattern, that rhetorical structure in all of them except one, in which Paul decides to grow it in a huge flower, and that's specifically the role of servant, which we'll talk about more deeply when we get to that as to why I think he did that. Now, I would observe with you that these verses here mirror the verses in Ephesians 5:22 to 6:9. They mirror. So what you see here is very similar to what you see in Ephesians. Paul deals with all the same individuals over there as he does here. Now, let me remind you that it is likely, we believe now, that Ephesians was actually written as an encyclical letter. It was not written specifically to the church at Ephesus. Yes, I know it probably says to the Ephesians in your Bible, but the vast majority of manuscripts of the letter don't have that phrase, to the Ephesians. It was most likely written as an encyclical. An encyclical is a letter that you write to be distributed, and to go around to different churches. So Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus, but he also wrote to the church at Laodicea, and probably to the church at Philadelphia, and Thyatira, and all the others mentioned in the 7 churches of Revelation in the early chapters of the book. In other words, Paul wasn't just writing to one particular church. We will see that later, chapter 4 and verse 16, where Paul will make mention of this letter. It is possible, therefore, that because he had written the encyclical, he shortens this set of instructions here because he's already given greater detail in that letter, and he expects the audience at Colossae to have read that. So there's really no reason for him to duplicate all of what he wrote there here, because they would have access to what he had written in the other letter. So he writes it with more detail over there, less detail here in favor of that letter. So over there, he explains why wives should submit to their husbands, because the husband is the head. And over there, he explains why husbands should, or what it means for husbands to love their wives, particularly as Christ being their head. It's detailed over there. Over here, Paul just gives the command. He doesn't give us all the details. Now, I'm convinced, of course, that these letters are contemporary. Paul wrote them at nearly the same time. It's highly likely that he may have even sent the letter to Colossae along with the letter going to the Ephesians when he sent it along with Epaphras. So it's certainly possible, certainly likely, I should say, that he is thinking about what he wrote there when he writes these words. That makes sense, at least to me. So as an exegete of this passage, it will be necessary to overview Paul's comments there, right? If he's thinking of what he wrote there when he writes this, then you and I, when we read this, we ought to read that and think about what that says as a part of dealing with this. So we're going to have to do that as a part of this process. But let me suggest there's even something more fundamental to that. To understand both of these passages, to understand what it is that Paul is saying in Ephesians 5 and 6 and what he's saying here in Colossians 3, it's going to be imperative for us to understand Paul's worldview in order to understand why he says what he says about husbands and wives, children and fathers, slaves and masters. You're going to have to understand what his thinking process is. Where is he coming from? How did he get this idea? How did he get this idea? Where did he get it from? In other words, what is Paul's understanding of marriage? What is Paul's understanding of parenthood? What is Paul's understanding of slave-master relationships? Where does he get that from? We're going to have to glean that first, I think, before we can even begin to flesh out what it is that Paul is trying to say about these various roles. In other words, we're going to have to plumb Paul's presuppositions. Paul's presuppositions, firstly, about marriage before we can even talk about wives submitting to their husbands and husbands loving their wives. What does Paul believe about the institution of marriage? If you don't get that, you're probably not going to understand what he's talking about here, and you're certainly not going to understand what it means to be a submissive wife and a loving husband if you don't understand where that comes from. So that's what we're going to need to do this morning. So what I'm going to do here today is start with a shortened review of what I originally preached all the way back from Ephesians in 2018. A few of you remember that. Long ago. I also preached a sermon series on marriage itself as a part of camp back in 2022, but my guess is most of you have forgotten that as well. So, here you go. Now, in my opinion, given the state of marriage in Western civilization, I really can't go wrong here, can I? I mean, it's not as though marriage is held in such great esteem and it's healthy in America. Okay, so I've got nothing to lose, in other words, by preaching this. Okay, so let's talk about, first, the sacredness of marriage. Okay, let's talk about marriage as an institution and its sacredness. And I'm going to put before you a number of assertions that marriage is. Okay, so I'm going to say marriage is a number of ways. First, marriage is a universal institution. Marriage is a universal institution. It has existed in every human civilization. It's a core institution in virtually every human society on this planet, from the beginning of time. There were people getting married in Egypt in the days of Abraham. Abraham, 2,000 years before Christ, 4,000 years removed from us, had a wife, didn't he? And he was a pagan living in southern Mesopotamia when he was called by God to go to Canaan. He brought his wife with him. Marriage has been around for a very long time. In fact, it's been a part of human civilization from the very beginning. It's ubiquitous in human society. But marriage is also a mixture of secular and religious interests. Now, this will seem odd to you, but marriage itself is not primarily a Christian institution. It's not. It pre-existed Christianity by several thousand years before Jesus ever showed up on the scene. In fact, before any scripture was written. One of probably the very earliest thing we have in our Bibles in terms of historical work is the book of Job. The man had a wife, didn't he? Now, unfortunately, she was not very submissive. She told him to curse God and die. So marriage is not primarily a Christian institution, nor is it primarily a religious one. We like to think of it that way as believers, but it's not fundamentally a religious institution. It has a mixture of both secular and religious interests. In the secular world, civilization's stability and longevity can be traced to the basic family unit, consisting and starting with a husband and a wife. This is being demonstrated so very profoundly in Western civilization now. The birth rates of the vast majority of Western countries has fallen below the replacement rate, which is even true here in America. The fundamental building block of society and ongoing surviving and thriving societies has been the basic family unit. Father and mother as husband and wife, children under that. That has been forever. As I said, it's ubiquitous in the world. So there is a secular sense that marriage is a good thing because it promulgates society itself. Now, yes, it does have a religious overtone in that it is also the promulgation of morality and the control of human sexuality, along with the dangers associated with human sexuality. Marriage is designed and seen in a religious sense from the perspective of us using that most fundamental reality of who we are, our sexuality. Flows from the very beginning when God said, let us create man in our image, male and female. So marriage is a universal institution that is both a mixture of secular and religious interests. But I would suggest to you that fundamentally, at its core, marriage is a theological concept. Marriage is something that comes from the mind of God. It's not something that human beings invented along the way. God established marriage, and it is a theological concept within both human and redemptive history. Both human history in general and redemptive history specifically. So let me put it in the form of a question. If marriage is an ancient institution, it's common to the entire civilized world, going all the way back to the beginning. Where do we find a specific definition of it? Where's the definition of this thing called marriage? Where did Abraham get the definition of marriage when he married his wife? 2,000 years before Christ, 4,000 years ago from our perspective. Job, where did he get the idea of marriage? Where did humanity get the idea of marriage? Did some caveman somewhere just decide one day that he was going to grab that cute little cave woman that he saw down the street and drag her into his cave and say, okay, she belongs to me now, as a building block of human society? You know, the fact is the Darwinists cannot explain marriage, because the simple fact is, in Darwinism, monogamous marriage does not make sense. It doesn't make sense. It's exactly contrary to a Darwinistic perspective of survival of the fittest. Where did it come from? And the answer, of course, is marriage is a theological idea. It's something established by God at the very outset of humanity. He considered it integral to both redemptive and human history. He saw it as foundational to civilization itself. The very foundation of humanity is marriage, a civilizational thing. In fact, what we would call this is a creation ordinance, established by God at the very creation of civilization and humanity itself, foundational to what it means to be human. It is God who established it. And thus, marriage is a creative act. Marriage is a creative act. Remember how God formed Adam from the dust of the ground, right? He took some dirt from the ground, some dust, and formed him and breathed into him, and he became a living being. And put him in a garden and set him to that place, and then made this rather bizarre statement. It is not good for the man to be alone. Well, he wasn't alone. God was with him. All the animals were there. He probably even saw and interacted with angelic beings, would be my guess. He was certainly not alone. What is this God meant by it's not good for the man to be alone? And the answer, of course, is that Adam needed a helper to fulfill his existence, to fulfill his purpose in this world as a human being. And so God formed Eve from him. Now again, notice, God didn't create Eve by taking some more dust and forming a creature and breathing into it. No, he took a part of the man out of him and formed it into the shape of a woman and brought her to the man. He created an extension of Adam. The woman became an extension. In fact, her name, woman, means she came from me. God forms a creature similar to Adam, yet different from him. Different from him. And this becomes the foundation of marriage. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, the verse starts with the word therefore, meaning here's my conclusion, God says. A man shall leave his father and his mother. Interesting that Adam didn't have a father and mother at that point, but he was to leave behind that which was his old self. and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. The very definition of marriage then is established by God in that verse. God gives Eve to Adam to fulfill his existence. That's what the therefore means. Draws a conclusion from what it is that God has done. The core of marriage being then, they shall become one flesh. They shall become one flesh. They shall become of one substance. One flesh. One nature between them. They shall become one, such that they cannot be divided. Because you can't tell where one leaves off and the other one begins, because they're part of the same thing. They may have the same substance, yes, but they have different roles. There's no doubt of that. We'll come back to that in a moment. They have complementary roles. It's obvious. But the core of marriage is a theological idea, a creative act in which God forms a new creature from two separate and different persons in the Imago Dei to fulfill his divine purpose. I love doing weddings. You know why? Because I get to speak something into existence that never existed before. I literally get to say the words, I now pronounce you husband and wife, and at that particular moment, they become one flesh. And they walk away from me not as two individuals, but as one thing. And I get to speak it into existence. I find that so very ironical, given the fact that God creates everything by speaking it into existence. Faith comes by hearing, implying someone spoke it. And we introduce this new creature then as Mr. and Mrs. And what God has joined together, let no man put asunder, because quite literally you have to rip it apart. So marriage is a creative act on the part of God to form something new in the world that becomes a bedrock of civilization itself, becomes foundational to the very existence of humanity. It becomes very foundational to the reality of what it means to be human. But we also know not only that marriage is a creative act, but we also think of marriage as a creation ordinance. And you remember in the very beginning of the Genesis account, when God finishes creating the world, he speaks all things into existence, and then he turns and he says, let us create man in our image, right? And give him dominion over everything. And then God blesses them. This is chapter 1, verse 28, Genesis 1, 28. And he says to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. We call this the creation ordinance. The creation mandate, the creation ordinance, is the creation of male and female to obey the following mandate. Number one, be fruitful and multiply. Human race is not going to get very far out of Eden if Adam and Eve don't have children. If they decide to be one of those cat couples, I'm not going to have any children. We're not going to have any children. We're just going to enjoy our life and vacations and spend our money and just die together with our cats. The human race ain't getting out of the Garden of Eden. That's it. Well, look, Cain would never kill his brother in that case, so maybe that's an upside. But you will notice that God purposed that the first thing that humanity is to do is to multiply, to fan out and fill the earth, procreate and reproduce the race. Now, we've done that pretty well, I would say. We have probably birthed upwards of 25 to 30 billion people on this planet from the beginning of time. Some estimate as high as 50 billion. I don't know. Right now there's 8.5 billion on the planet, but so we've done a pretty good job of procreating, but we haven't filled the earth yet, have we? In fact, it is estimated you could take all the people of the world and give them a comfortable living space just in the state of Florida. I'm not suggesting that, but the other half of that command is be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth and take dominion over all things. You will notice that's part of the marriage mandate. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and take dominion over all other things. And this, I would argue, is the establishment of human civilization itself. The very essence of what it means to be human. To go out into the world and to conquer all that God creates. We are extraordinarily creative beings, aren't we? Nod your heads, that's right. We are. I mean, have you ever just walked through the aisles of a Hobby Lobby? Really? Those of you who husbands, when your wife drags you to Hobby Lobby, right? Just let her go and shop for whatever she wants, and you just wander through and look at all the stuff. Unbelievable the kinds of things they have in that place. There's some things I've never even imagined could be made by human beings. We're creative. We can create lots of stuff. God has given to us this world. Use it. Use the immense creativity that I, your God, have given to you to make and form and produce things. I mean, we have produced things in the 20th and 21st century that are beyond our comprehension. I mean, if you would have told me 40 years ago when I walked into the first computer job that I would have a computer in my pocket that's 10 million times more powerful than the computers they used to put a man on the moon in 1969, I thought you were nuts. But I do. We are creative people. Go out and take the world and do so as husband and wife with children. And secondly, not only are we to subdue the earth and take dominion over all things, but we are to establish order and lawfulness in all things. This is really what Adam was supposed to do primarily. Not only to be creative with all things, but to establish order. Dominion implies order. Dominion implies that you are controlling everything that takes place. And there's one particular thing running around upon the earth that needed to be taken dominion over. And his name was Satan. Now, when he slithered into the garden to attack Adam's wife, Adam's responsibility was to take that serpent by the throat and say, I'm sorry, I have dominion here. You stay away from my wife. And throw him out of the garden. That's what he should have done. In fact, I would argue that's the primordial sin that led to all the rest. But that's what Adam was given the responsibility to do. Establish order and lawfulness in the world. He was to take the dominion of the world, to conquer it and subject everything to himself, and she was to be his helper in doing that. And she was to be the one that would bring forth the children that would perpetuate that dominion and that subjugation in the world. He had his role, she had her role. Marriage is a central part of the creation ordinance, at the heart of the dominion of humanity over this planet in accordance with God's purposes throughout. Listen, hear me. When a society decides that marriage is no longer important, that society begins to degrade. It begins to falter. It begins to lose its way. And eventually, it is wiped from the earth by God himself. In other words, any other view of marriage that defines this union differently or fails to take into account these two creation mandates fails the test of authenticity. If your marriage, quote unquote, is not able to produce children, it is not consistent with what it is that God himself has established as the means and the cornerstone of civilization. But we would go one step further and say that not only that, but marriage is a covenant relationship. Marriage is a covenant relationship. In Malachi chapter 2, verses 13 through 16, and I won't go into great detail here, but I'll just say it in summary. What you have is a relationship of promise in marriage, illustrating God's covenant-making, promise-keeping nature. In marriage, what you have is a picture of God who makes covenants and keeps them. That's why there is a very specific prohibition against adultery in the commandments, because it is a reflection of the very nature of God himself. God is a promise-keeping God. He witnesses his own covenants. He is faithful to that covenant when he makes it, and he completes it in the end. So in a covenant, you have a promise, witnesses, faithfulness, and completion. And you see that in marriage, pictured in marriage. It is a picture of the very nature of God himself. This is why God says that he hates divorce. Why? Because marriage is a reflection of his nature, a reflection of who he is as God. It's a part of his faithfulness, his witnessing of it, his promise and his completion. The ultimate covenant, of course, is the covenant that God has made with his elect people. Agreed? The ultimate promise that God has made, the ultimate covenant that he's made, is with those that he calls to himself by grace through faith. We call them the elect. The ultimate covenant is what Christ has accomplished on behalf of the elect. And we understand the faithfulness of God in that covenant. We're banking on it. We're banking on it, aren't we? We are assured of our salvation on the grounds that God keeps his promises. When God says, all who will call upon the name of the Lord will be saved, and I call upon the name of the Lord to be saved, then I'm trusting that he holds his word. Is that not pictured in marriage? When a bride, I should say, stands before the minister and looks into the eyes of her spouse or about to be spouse and says, I do. And he says, I do. There are oaths exchanged. And what's the expectation when they leave? Faithfulness. A promise made and kept until the end. And that's what marriage pictures. It pictures the covenant relationship that God has with his people. In fact, I would even argue that at the core of the gospel itself, one of the primary ideas that's expressed somewhat subtly in the New Testament is that the Father, as a part of his covenant with his Son, gave to him a bride that would be his and faithful to him to the end. It's a subtle picture, but it's there. In fact, if you really want support for the idea of arranged marriages, there you have it. The Father arranged a marriage for his Son. And frankly, if I might be so bold, I think we need to get back to that. So all of these things are true of marriage, but there is a seventh, and that is marriage is also the culminating act in the redemptive plans of God. Not only does this go into the secular world and the religious world, but it also goes into the very redemptive realities. Marriage, biblical marriage, is defined very simply as a divinely designed, lifelong, monogamous, heterosexual, covenantal union between one man and one woman. Notice all those words that I just used. It's divinely appointed, divinely designed, it's lifelong, it's monogamous, it's heterosexual, and it's a covenantal union between one man and one woman for the purpose of, all right, going back to what we were talking about before, establishing human civilization in the creation mandate, picturing God's own personal nature. We see it in the covenantal idea of God himself. And thirdly, moving now on, foreshadowing his unique relationship with those he would redeem. We are the product of Christ fulfilling the creation mandate. He has been fruitful and multiplied and has taken dominion over all things. See, I'm absolutely convinced that Jesus Christ is in the process right now, through the gospel, through the church, of doing what Adam failed to do, taking dominion over everything. He took the ancient serpent by the throat when he walked out of the tomb and chained him up. He has now set forth his people into the world, his bride go into the world to multiply themselves to all the nations of the earth, until all of it, the whole world, kingdoms, nations, civilizations, languages, arts, culture, technology, science, etc., all belongs to him. It's a picture of the creation-mandated marriage in the world today. When we marry, we are picturing this reality in the world. So that is what marriage is. Now, unfortunately, we live in a fallen world, don't we? I really wonder what marriage would look like if Eve had not eaten from the tree, or more particularly, if Adam had grabbed that serpent by the throat and thrown him out of the garden. I really would like to know what marriage would have looked like. The problem, of course, now is that everything in this world has been placed under the curse. The judgments that were pronounced by God upon all creation as a consequence of the fall, we see it in Genesis chapter 3. He spoke first to the serpent and condemned him to a life of humiliation. That's what he means by him eating the dust of the ground. He will now be in subjection rather than having power. Ending, of course, at his utter destruction at the cross. But then God turns to the man and the woman. First he turns to the woman and he curses her. And what does he give to her? He gives to her pain in the thing she was designed to do. Which is what? Be fruitful and multiply. She was given this glorious thing of bearing children, but now she has to suffer in doing it. And then God turns to Adam and curses him along the very same lines. Whereas Adam was to take dominion over the earth and to control all things and subjugate all things, now he would not be able to do so. Even growing the food of the ground would be a constant fight. He would have to eventually invent Roundup. And even that doesn't work because the little buggers keep coming back. He would have to toil to bring forth his food from the ground, resulting in him literally working himself back into the ground from which he came. Toiling himself back into the very ground. No dominion and no joy in childbirth. The two things that these were created to do. So the curse worked against the creation mandate to frustrate their ability to do all of these. But that curse also leaked into marriage too, unfortunately. The relationship between the husband and the wife. Again, as I said, marriage is the foundation upon which the creation ordinance itself was established. So not only was the result of that union corrupted, but the union itself was corrupted. Probably the greatest example of it in all of Scripture. after they had sinned, the man says, "It's that woman you gave me." Immediately he deflected away his own responsibility onto her, because he knew that what he had done was a failure. So he tried to blame it on her. That's a function of the curse that came down upon them. Like all things in the created order, like everything in this world, both the institution of marriage and individual marriages have been corrupted by sin, both from the outside and from the inside. From the outside, it looks like this. We have been, as human beings, from the time of the fall, attempting to redefine the concept of marriage in accordance with our own ideas. We've been doing this from the beginning of time. Look, it's not new to our generation. Oh, we've come up with some pretty novel ones in recent years. But the fact of the matter is, we've been doing it for a very long time. Polygamy has been around for a long, long time. Adultery's been around for a long, long time. Incest, no-fault divorce, gay marriage, whatever in the world that is. All of these things have been around from the earliest days of human history. We've been doing this for a long time, and they strike at the very heart of the creation ordinance. They violate the one-flesh relationship in various ways. Obviously, two men coming together cannot produce children. Two women coming together cannot produce children, clearly. And so that's what we would call strange flesh relationships. They're not a one-flesh relationship. They're a strange flesh relationship. They specifically pervert God's intention for marriage. And so the outward attack is societies in rebellion against God, striking at the very heart of the thing that God created at the beginning. Because the reprobate man says, I will have none of it. If God said it, it's wrong, and I don't want it. So let's create a new institution of marriage, and let's redefine it however we want to. Jesus himself said, didn't he? From the beginning, it has not been this way. So there have been outward forces that have been attempting to change marriage, but there are also inward forces. I've asked you this question before. Let's see if you remember the answer. What is the primary effect of the fall on the nature of human beings? When Eve ate from the tree, what was the primary effect of what she did upon man? And the answer, of course, is utter self-focus. It's all about me. Pride is basically the essence of thinking more highly of yourself than you ought to, because all your focus is on yourself. Ever since the fall, ever since Adam uttered those words, it's that woman you gave me. It's been all about us and our own desires and our own purposes and our own plans. You don't believe me? Look at an 18-month-old child. Just go walk in that nursery and watch the children play with the toys. I can assure you that the little 18-month-old child grabs the toy out of the other child's hand without one qualm of sharing. It's mine. And I don't care if she has it or not. I'm taking it. We're born with it. It's at the very core of our existence. I'm sorry, parents, I shattered your view of your child there. I didn't mean to do that. I know you think your child is perfect and so forth. And maybe your child is. Wink, wink. This radical self-centeredness that now permeates us, this sense of self-focus, inclines us to concentrate on ourselves. Me. Adam and Eve took their eyes off of God to seek for something else, and in doing so, locked themselves into an inward focus forever. The internal corruption of marriage occurs then. The curse from within comes when you attempt to take two fundamentally self-centered people and put them together in a one-flesh relationship. Boom! All of you who are married are thinking, that makes sense. Because it is all about her. In this case, now here's where we're coming back to the passage. In this case, this picture of corruption then is wives who reject their roles and husbands who diminish their roles under the creation mandate. You see? To understand what Paul means when he says, wives be submissive to your husbands and husbands love your wives, goes back to Paul's presuppositions. And the presupposition of the Apostle Paul is that God originally intended for men and women to be joined together in one flesh union. But what happens when you try to put together two fundamentally self-centered individuals into a so-called one flesh relationship? Well, frankly, it's a little like mixing oil and water. So this is why you have these kinds of problems that he has to address. The result then is that there is no perfect marriage within this fallen world. As long as it's made up of fallen people, you might get along for 40, 50, 60 years. Love each other and care for each other and stay together. Good for you, and you should. But it's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be a perfect one flesh union. Not on this side of eternity. But, you knew there was a but coming. But, the new self given by the Spirit has at its core the purpose of redeeming this fallen relationship in the believing husband and wife as God has ordained it to be. See, you might have taken my previous statement that there's no perfect marriage and said, what does that mean for us? Well, Paul is putting this within the context of what it means to live in the new self. The new self permeates then and comes into and is involved in the reality of what it means to be a wife and what it means to be a husband. See? Paul is giving here a specific example of what it means to put on the new self. And he says it like this: wife, put on the new self by being submissive to your husband. Husbands, put on the new self by loving your wife. See it? Comes out of Paul's presuppositions about what has taken place in this world, that the fall has corrupted things, but the good news is God is working to redeem all things. Christ has come to redeem all things. Thus, marriage, like everything else in the created order, has been corrupted under the pride and selfishness of men and women, but stands to be redeemed as all other things are. I might put it like this in more simpler terms. If you are a follower of Christ and so is your wife, there's hope for your marriage. Because Christ is redeeming two into one. Now, coming back to this text then. There's a familiar purpose here, and the familiar purpose, of course, is how husbands and wives are to relate to each other. Wives being submissive, husbands loving. And we treat these passages often as a treatise on how marriage can work well. But let me suggest to you that Paul actually has a greater intention here. He's picturing here Christ's relationship with his own church. As I said, that subtle idea of a groom-bride relationship between Christ and his church. We see him, in fact, compare the husband-wife relationship to the Christ-church relationship. We see that in Ephesians 5 as he's talking to husbands. And then he builds on that husband and wife relationship here as a Christ-body relationship, because that's the way he was talking about it in this book. So Paul comes forth with this idea that the self-sacrificial love of Christ has created an intimate, one flesh relationship between himself and the church. A one flesh relationship. And I know that because earlier in this book, what did he call the church? What was the word he used to describe the church? The body, of which he is the head. That's a one flesh union. That's right. Your head is connected to your body. They're one flesh. Okay? You can't go without one. Although there's some days I think I've forgotten where I put my head. But in Colossians 3 then, proper marital behavior becomes an example of what it means to put on the new self, to live in imitation of Christ as best seen in the marital relationship. First, between him and his bride, the church, and then between us as husband and wife. That's where Paul is getting this from. Paul isn't just pulling wives and husbands out of thin air and saying, let me use this as an example. No. He's drawing from that idea that's deep within his presuppositions, that marriage is a union between a man and a woman that produces a one flesh relationship between them. And that one flesh relationship becomes offspring from the one flesh relationship. And those offspring have the DNA of both of the parents as a part of the one flesh union. Your children are a good picture of a one flesh union because they're both you and your wife. Or vice versa. Right? See it? So he's saying here that this picture of marriage, this idea of wives submitting and husbands loving, is flowing out of this larger redemptive picture of what it is that Christ is doing in the world. And that's why wives should be submissive to their husbands. And that's why husbands should love their wives as Christ loved the church. See it? It's more than just instructions on how to be a good wife. It's more than how to be a good husband. It's all about how it is understood within the framework of the larger picture of what Christ is doing in this world. Marriage is a divine institution established for the welfare of society as a whole, certainly, and for the betterment of individuals, no doubt. It's an example of the relationship God has established between himself and his chosen people in Christ. It has redemptive overtones. And it's a picture of how those belonging to the body of Christ walk in him. So that gives us the ground upon which these commands are built. So what that should do, as we come back and talk about the commands themselves next week, Lord willing, that you look at them not as, Paul's trying to tell me to be submissive to my husband. He doesn't know anything about my husband. No. This should be us looking at this and going, so what you're saying, what Paul is saying is, these instructions are part of the grander picture of what marriage is all about from the foundation and what it means to walk in Christ, who is himself the last Adam who has come to do what the first married couple failed to do. Oh. So I guess that submissive thing is not so offensive after all. Think those things. Think those thoughts as we consider these passages moving forward.